Welcome everyone, and I'm afraid I had forgotten that we've extended the what normally is the 6 week format of these online studies. I forgot we actually had extended it by an extra week. So when I book these webinars, then I sort of slot in particular dates. And I had simply just forgotten that we had extended it. Anyway, I'm glad that you who are here actually then got the link and so forth. But of course, that's probably why there might only be a few of us tonight. So I'm rather guilty in that regard. Anyway, here we are. And it's, as always, a privilege to be sharing these you could say this study with you, and this will then be our last in this series. I guess most of you know that on Wednesdays I'm also going through a study of a particular text by Jamgön, Mipham, which is called the Sword of Wisdom. So I hope this present study has sort of whetted your appetite for engaging in that study, which is also, I think, really important. Anyway, so last time we were looking at emptiness and the non-conceptual. So these are some big topics. Let's just see here. So for that purpose, then, it makes sense to invoke the blessing of Jamgön Mipham Rinpoche. Through the blessing of awareness, emptiness, Manjushri Kumara, you open the expanse of wisdom and its 8 minds of confidence, thus mastering the vast treasuries of transmission and realization. Mipham Manjushri Gosha, I supplicate you. Okay. So last time we didn't quite complete that chapter. So what we were looking at there is the understanding of emptiness. So emptiness, of course, is not just an idea, but it's really a critique in which we then arrive at the nature of reality. It's dismantling our assumptions, but there's different traditions that deal with this. And so we have here, and we've outlined this previously, so I'm not going to dwell too much on it, but really just to sort of revise. We have the Jonang, the Shentong, who would say that emptiness negates everything but, you could say, the absolute nature. They negate everything that is unreal, and what is left is then the real. So they assert there is something that actually exists ultimately. They're called Shentongs then. So what emptiness in their tradition negates is unreal phenomena. So what is empty of what? In the sense that the reality, Buddha nature, we would say just like a gem that's covered in something in dirt. That gem there is the real thing. The dirt is the unreal phenomena. And so once we eliminate the unreal phenomena, we're left with what is real, which is Buddha nature, awakening. So that's where we would say the true reality, Buddha nature, is empty of unreal phenomena. And the way that they do this is that they would say that emptiness is an implicative negation, in the sense that we say that it is empty of something. So it means that there's still something left. The classical image of this is always, we say, an implicative negation is when we say the Brahmin doesn't drink beer. That means that he drinks all sorts of other things, but he doesn't drink beer. He doesn't drink alcohol, right? So that's an implicative negation. It sort of leaves that there is something that is there. So in that way, we would say then they would negate what is not Buddha nature, namely unreal phenomena. And then the referent, of what they refer to as emptiness, is then in relation to a substrate, that there's something there, the ground of reality, what is real. That's Buddha nature. The Gelug tradition, coming down from Tsongkhapa, then, is what emptiness negates is inherent existence. And this is what we're going to be looking at more here. It simply just says that how we should understand the nature of emptiness is that all phenomena, they lack inherent existence. That is what emptiness negates, that phenomena have inherent existence. And again, that is, we would say all phenomena empty of inherent existence. You could say that's it, and that's a non-implicative negation. It doesn't say that phenomena are empty of some things, but they just say all phenomena are empty. And what the referent of the emptiness is then the quality, in the sense that we are attributing something to phenomena that they do not possess. So that's where we are failing to see the empty nature of phenomena. Now, Mipham Rinpoche, he adapts the format that we have from the Svatantrika, or rather the Yogacarya Svatantrika Madhyamika, which is understanding the way in which we can understand absolute truth in terms of an idea and then actual realization. So when we talk about the idea, then yes, he says it makes sense to talk about how phenomena don't have inherent existence. So that's where you then sustain that idea, okay, phenomena, they don't possess inherent existence. But what he calls the uncategorized, that again, that comes down to then the non-conceptual. And that is the realization or the insight that goes beyond conceptual constructs. So that's freedom from conceptual constructs. That's what emptiness negates, or rather, emptiness negates conceptual constructs. So that's where the first is really the emptiness negates inherent existence. In the categorized absolute, in the uncategorized absolute, it negates conceptual constructs altogether. Sorry, so yes. And then when it comes to what is empty of what, then we would say in the first category, the categorized ultimate, phenomena are empty of inherent existence. And in the second category, the uncategorized ultimate, reality is empty of conceptual constructs. So, same thing. Now, the type of negation used to indicate emptiness is a non-implicative negation. And again, that is where, as far as the negation, the practice of negation goes, then Mipham Rinpoche is fine with a non-implicative negation, but we're going to see a little bit about how that plays out. He agrees with the Gelug approach in terms of the categorized absolute, and that's where what is the referent there is the quality, the nature of emptiness, that is, you could say, the abiding reality behind phenomena or appearances, and the uncategorized. And that is where there's no referent whatsoever. So that's then what he understands as the unity of appearance and emptiness. There's perception, and yet there's no grasping. This is the scope then of the uncategorized ultimate. So this is really just to sort of revise what we looked at last time. But then there's a discussion that famously Tsongkhapa says, and this is something that where we have to remember that the issue here, it's not so much that Mipham wanted to pick a fight, but it's more that there were certain ideas of Tsongkhapa that really, as part of, you could say, that discursive hegemony that really held the colleges and the study of sutra teachings, that had become so dominant that Mipham Rinpoche wanted to come back to some of the important points, really, that really defines the way in which we understand emptiness, particularly in the Nyingma tradition. So when Tsongkhapa says a pot is not empty of pot, it is empty of inherent existence, that actually works fine, because we're not going to say, oh, there's nothing there. What we're really interested in is just let go of the grasping. So in that sense, to say that, it avoids that we just have what we call an overextension of the negation of inherent existence. That's what's in you could say, and it's fine, you could say, in terms of just initially to say that. And otherwise we'd end up saying there's nothing whatsoever. That would be an overextension. So when in general, what we could call the Ngarapa in Tibetan means the earlier traditions of Madhyamika, when they negated conventionally, they, or rather than the Gelug would say, Tsongkhapa would say, to negate it altogether conventionally entails nihilism, and that's fine. And Mipham Rinpoche agrees that it's to deny conventional objects indeed is an overextension. Otherwise, yes, we just say everything's empty, you know, there's no cause, no effect, no this, no that. But the thing is, when you're doing that, and this is something we've looked at earlier, that involves dividing the two truths. And actually, Tsongkhapa wishes to be a prasangika. But actually, what he's doing here, actually, when he begins to divide the two truths, because he's saying, you know, there's the in relative truth, there is of course a pot, and yet it lacks inherent existence. Then there is a division between these two dimensions. There's the pot as it conventionally exists, and then there is its lack of inherent existence. So that's applying the two truth model, which the Prasangika, by the definition, by definition, Prasangika don't do that. And so that's where in the nature, if we could say in the absolute, we really were Prasangika, we wouldn't make that kind of division. Pot and emptiness would not be two different things. They would simply just be what we call the cowherd's view of, yes, there's a pot, but as far as the reality of it, emptiness. So dividing like that, that is where Mipham basically, you could say, identifies Tsongkhapa as not being consistent with being a prasangika. And also, in that he says there's a pot, but it's empty of something else, then there's still something that's remains. And that means, again, there's a substrate that essentially positions him as also being a shentong, or you could say a other empty. Anyway, the statement here particularly then entails subscribing to the view of the autonomy school. So this is just a little bit of imprecision that Mipham Rinpoche feels it's important to mention. When the two truths have been, he says, or Douglas Duckworth says, when the two truths have been divided, to deny the existence of a conventional truth, such as a pot, because of its ultimate emptiness, is to misidentify the domain of ultimate analysis, which investigates the way things are, not the way things appear. Therefore, he agrees that negating the ultimate existence of an object is not to deny its existence conventionally, that is, the fact that it undeniably appears. So there's a place, of course, where they agree, but also a place where there's a disagreement here. Now, still, again, with regards to some of the positions that we have, there's also the Jonang. And the Jonang tradition, they would say, and this is the famous Shentong view, they would say that to assert, they assert wisdom. You could say that which is, you could say, awakens to Buddha nature as ultimately true. But that's where Mipham Rinpoche would say, it's only conventional truth. We could say in terms of experience, we could say there is the recognition of wisdom. But he would always remain with the Prasangika view that anything that's subjected to what we call absolute analysis necessarily is established as empty. We say nothing holds up to absolute analysis. The phenomena of samsara nirvana, nothing has any, you could say, ultimate inherent existence. And so that's where they're, even though the Mipham Rinpoche, he agrees with the Jonang in terms of establishing the authentic experience of wisdom, then ultimately, then he wouldn't agree that it has some ultimate truth. So that's why in terms of the path, yes, Mipham accepts it is ultimate in terms of authentic experience. So that again, coming back to phenomenology and to ontology, there's an experience of absolute of wisdom as ultimately true. Yes, it's part of authentic experience, as we looked at the two-truth model of authentic and inauthentic experience. But ontologically, in terms of appearance and emptiness, then when we assert that kind of two-truth model, then we would say that it is, then it like everything else, it has no inherent existence. So Douglas Duckworth, he says here, therefore, the ultimate truth is only emptiness when approached analytically. However, when wisdom is approached experientially, in meditative equipoise, we can say that wisdom, as the undistorted encounter with reality, exists as the ultimate truth of authentic experience. Even what appears as the conventional truth of pure vision, given that it is the content of authentic experience, can be said to be ultimate truth. And this is important. We're going to be looking more at that, because that also we would say then that when we talk about pure perception, phenomena, relative phenomena in their pure aspect, without the veils of duality that they arise in terms of purity, that would be ultimate truth from the point of view of authentic experience. So this is again what we've covered in some of the earlier chapters. So we have these two traditions that we refer to as Rangtong and Shentong. This is when you go in there, then there's a when you go into Madhyamika, then this is something that is discussed a fair bit. And you can say, why are we discussing this? Isn't it just non-conceptual? Well, the thing is, it sharpens us. It sharpens our understanding of what we mean with it. And it actually enables us to relax into some certainty once we've, you could say, removed all doubts with regards to what we mean by this. So Mipham's position, and that's where Douglas Duckworth says, because Mipham Rinpoche actually sees the brilliance in both the yogic practice school, the consequentialist school, and so forth. So he's actually very pleased with either of them, but he also makes some points about where there's subtle differences, or rather where there are points where he doesn't agree with either of them actually. But he says there's some very good points in both of these schools. So you can say he's a very independent thinker, but he's also somebody who really actually brings all these differing viewpoints together and actually makes this synthesis. This is a point that Douglas Duckworth will be making at the end of the book. So he says, Mipham does clearly say that a statement of emptiness as a lack of true existence should be understood to be a non-implicative negation, not an implicative negation, because the latter simply involves another entity conceptualized in the mind. Now, that's also fair enough. If we say that there is something that's left over once we've negated, that there's an implication of something that's other, then there is some reference point. And that's what you could say the importance of the Rangtong, the sort of genuine prasangika, is that there is no reference point. However, emptiness is emptiness, how, and again, this is again coming back to experience, how emptiness is experienced is a different story. The non-conceptual experience of emptiness need not be evoked exclusively by a negation. Given that it is non-conceptual, there's no reason why it could not be evoked by an affirmation as well. So it's never going to be about dwelling on any thoughts. And so one way we could say, well, there's nothing that possesses inherent existence, including the nature of mind. But also some could say, well, nature of mind is that which, like Milarepa would do. You know, he'd say the absolute nature, that's when there's no thoughts about the past, no thoughts about the future, and no entanglement within the present thoughts. That uncontrived, virginal, pristine mind. This is the nature of mind. And for the student who hears that, they might recognize this within themselves, and without settling into a reference point, might just sustain a non-conceptual experience, which does not fall into duality. So that's where the point is that this nature can be both, you could say, pointed out by negation, but also by affirmation. So Douglas Duckworth says, insisting that the content of non-conceptual experience be determined undermines the possibility of that experience occurring. Nevertheless, We can also see how each of the two types of negation can play a role in overcoming a conceptual tendency towards reification. To overcome the tendency. A non-implicative negation can function tendency to pin the non-conceptual down as some sort of idea, while an implicative negation can function to overcome the tendency to hold on to it as a simple absence by inviting us to open up to its experiential presence. Even so, for Mipham, neither form of negation can adequately represent the non-conceptual unity that can only be known by in one's individual experience. As soon as the non-conceptual is determined by thought and language, it will necessarily not adequately reflect the experience because of being a mere conceptualization of it. So that's where trying to get an idea, even the idea is about a negation, even the idea is about some form of affirmation or whatever, we have to understand it ultimately boils down to being something that is entirely non-conceptual. And that's why, in a way, Mipham Rinpoche, he's fine with various ways that this is approached. So this is that's emptiness in the non-conceptuals. Now we're looking at the very last chapter here, immanent wisdom. We're covering some big material. So Douglas Duckworth says, according to Mipham, and this is, of course, when we talk about immanent wisdom, we're talking about Buddha nature. And what we're going to be seeing here is that as we proceed in what we call the various vehicles, sometimes we talk about, for example, the 9 jhanas, Padmasambhava's 9 jhanas, and we're going to be looking at that. But that's where we would say, as the jhanas, we could say, advance, as they ascend, we would say there's increasing trust in that we can understand Buddha nature. There's also an increase, you could say, unity with our experience. So you could say at the very basic level, enlightenment is approached as something where we need to entirely adapt a new lifestyle. We need to move away from the world and isolate ourselves and so forth. And then gradually, as we progress through the path, then, like for example, in the Bodhisattva jhana, there's more integration with the world, and finally with Vajrayana, there's a complete integration with all our experience and our entire, you'd say, experience of our body, speech, and mind in our sort of in our world. So that's where we could say as we ascend the various views, there's increasing skill in terms of integrating. And there's also an increased sense that Buddhahood can be done. It is something that can be known. It's something that can be accomplished. So Douglas Duckworth says here, according to Mipham, the meaning of Buddha nature is the unity of appearance and emptiness. Buddha nature also embodies the unconditioned qualities of a Buddha, such as wisdom, love, and power, which according to Mipham are essentially present when one is a sentient being. He states that Buddha nature refers to the existence of wisdom as the innate nature of the minds of all sentient beings, because when this innate nature of mind is realized, one becomes a Buddha. So that's where Mipham Rinpoche's understanding of Buddha nature is not that we gradually build up something, but rather it's that we unveil something that was always there. He says the fact that the unconditioned qualities of a Buddha intrinsically exists as the ground of being is an important feature of the Nyingma view. Since wisdom is unconditioned, it cannot be produced by anything, and for this reason wisdom must be present from the primordial beginning as the true nature, the Buddha nature of all sentient beings. So this is a very important way in which Buddha nature and the nature of the entire path is understood in the Nyingma tradition, and of course also in other traditions, but in slightly different ways. So we're going to look at that. According to Mipham, he says the meaning of Buddha nature is the unity of emptiness and appearance. Buddha nature also embodies the unconditioned qualities of a Buddha, such as wisdom, love, and power, which according to Mipham are essentially present when one is a sentient being. So Buddha nature is the purity that pervades all phenomena in terms of both subjective experience and the objective world. There's at all times the appearances, whether it's cognitive on the subjective level or whether it's perceptive in terms of the external level, all of these have no intrinsic existence if we analyze, and yet they appear. So that absolute unity, the inseparability of emptiness and appearance, this is the original uncontaminated nature of both the phenomenal world and our own nature. But it's also to be understood that then all the qualities that we associate with awakening, and that is where we generally always refer to the three main qualities, wisdom, love, and power, as being innate, spontaneously present from the very start. And by the way, in terms of iconography, you come across the bodhisattvas that represent these three. There's Manjushri that represents wisdom, there's Avalokiteshvara that represents love, and there's Vajrapani that represents power. So these are, you could say, the spontaneously present qualities that are innate to the awakened nature. So in this way, we understand that this nature is basic to us. It's something that we naturally possess. And that's where we talk about two purities, Rangshi Nedar, or natural purity. And this is what both Buddhas and sentient beings possess, Buddha nature, basically. But we have what veils Buddha nature. And that's where the Buddhas, they're distinguished by, they have a purity of being free from these, you could say, adventitious, fleeting, temporary defilements. An important point is, as we again ascend as we ascend the various views, then there's an increasing understanding of the of these adventitious defilements as being workable. At the very fundamental yanas, then there's almost ascension. We have that in the discourse of some of the Buddhist traditions, that to become a Buddha almost impossible, so difficult. Whereas when we gradually ascend the various yanas, there's very much the sense that this is something that's absolutely workable. So already from the level of the Mahayana, really, Trungpa Rinpoche, he says between samsara and nirvana, then nirvana has the upper hand. At the end of the day, nirvana or enlightenment. Nirvana, when you say nirvana here, it's really synonymous with enlightenment. But at the end of the day, we have to understand that is what is real. Sounding a little bit Shentong-like, but it is what is undiluted. It is what truly is who we are, what reality is. So again, that's where, again, a little bit like what we were talking about on Wednesdays, when we begin to assert reality, we begin to connect with what is real. Then we're doing that on the basis of actually investigating what is actually there. That's what constitutes valid cognition. Anyway, there's two kinds of effects, and we sometimes would approach there's some traditions that would actually say that Buddha nature is something, or the wisdom that recognizes Buddha nature, it's something that comes about as a ripened effect. And that's where, of course, that's true in the sense that we practice the path and eventually we have realization. But as far as the wisdom that knows the absolute nature, this could also be understood in terms of just being something that is always there, present, within the inseparability then of wisdom and Buddha nature, as what is spontaneously there, and as such, it exists as what we call a freed effect. It's not something that's produced by anything, but it's simply just something that is that's manifest on the basis of what veils it is has been eliminated. So the freed effect is simply just that there's something that's unconditionally there on the basis of being freed by what veils it. Again, there's a little bit sort of Shentong, but again, this is we're really just talking about the experience. So Mipham would say that Buddha nature is a unity of appearance and emptiness. Its quality is originally perfect. And that's where we say Buddha nature, all the qualities that come with it, is always there. There's nothing that is actually generated on the basis of cause and effect. And this is again coming back to what we say here. All the qualities, they're not something that was built up and so forth. And this we sometimes would see in some of the traditions. They would say, oh yeah, the activity of a Buddha will be according to their prayers from before they attained enlightenment. So the Gelug, they have a very different understanding of Buddha nature. They would see Buddha nature as really just as emptiness. And this is something that has become fundamental to the Gelug tradition, is really just understanding Buddha nature as emptiness. There's somewhere where Douglas Duckworth says this is something that I think came about on the basis of Gyaltsab Tsongkhapa's one of Tsongkhapa's main disciples, that essentially really brought home that Buddha nature is simply just emptiness, the absence of inherent existence. That's how we should understand it. So that differs from saying that it is both appearance and emptiness, and as such, Buddha nature pervades all appearances. It is again coming back to this absence in which the appearances, we would say then, they are there, but what they are, they exist, but they're free of inherent existence. And this is again problematic. As we saw before, Gorampa, a great Sakya master, says that Buddha nature, just like Mipham, is the unity of emptiness appearance. But the Buddha's wisdom, the qualities that recognize this nature, that's something that's produced by the path. So that's where there is something which is then, you could say, contrived or produced on the basis of the path in terms of the accumulation of merit and wisdom. The Jonang tradition, they would say that Buddha nature is always there from the very start, is something that's there from the beginning. The quality is originally perfect. So as such, the Jonang, Mipham agrees with the Jonang in that sense that it's originally there, but also he would say, even though the qualities of the Buddha nature are originally there, they are empty. They do not withstand absolute analysis. So that's where the Jonang would say, no, it's real. Mipham, and it has inherent existence. Mipham would say that it's for sure experientially real, conventionally real, but in the absolute, it's empty. Now, what is brilliant in that is that Mipham actually, where the Jonang, they would say the third turning of the wheel, that then asserts Buddha nature as absolute. They would then say the second turning of the wheel, the teachings on emptiness, that's just what we would call expedient teachings. The third turning of the wheel is what we call definitive teachings. The second turning of the wheel of emptiness, they would say that's expedient teachings. And that's where Longchenpa, and I think also Rongzompa, and certainly Jamgön Mipham, they would say both the second turning on emptiness and the third turning of the wheel on Buddha nature, they are both definitive teachings. And they would say if they're separated, then they both constitute expedient teachings. If they're united, then they both constitute the definitive meaning. So that way, then Mipham is fine with with both of these you could say assertions. The second turning that asserts emptiness, Mipham just says definitely. And again, there we could say that's an ontological perspective. The third turning of the wheel, the abiding purity of Buddha nature as having been there from the very start, you would say definitely. So from the point of view of the experience, of the experiential aspect. So again, we also what we looked at in the previous chapter, the second turning is more about the objective perspective. The third turning is more about the subjective perspective. And of course, these are united within the non-conceptual. So when we have that, and particularly when we're talking about the Nyingma understanding of Vajrayana, then this insight into emptiness as united with the spontaneous presence of Buddha nature. This is the basis for the way that the Nyingma approach the resultant vehicle of the Vajrayana. The resultant vehicle is then the path that takes this abiding purity, Buddha nature, as the ground of the path. That's the starting point of the path. And that is taking the quality of the undiluted dimension of the mind as deity, as the path. And that's where then this understanding becomes the understanding of Buddha nature becomes the ground. We call it then ground tantra. Then the practice of the path tantra. And this then results in unveiling what was always there, which is then the fruition tantra. And as such, we would say ground and fruition are inseparable. Now, as such, the mantra vehicle is a natural extension of the sutra vehicle. There's not any notion that the mantra vehicle is off on a different planet in any way. It builds on the insight that you could say the sutra vehicle, the paramita vehicle, it culminates in the insight of the prajna paramita, which is the freedom from conceptual constructs, the non-conceptual. And so that is then where the Vajrayana works with that and has that as the objective of the wisdom that sees what we call the Dhamma Dhatu, or the absolute space of reality. And then this is integrated skillfully on the basis of engaging the vision of the already spontaneous perfect qualities as innate. And that's where we're going to look at these. These are approached then in terms of deity as external and also deity as intrinsic to us. But the view of these are in principle then the insight of the paramita vehicle, the insight into emptiness, the insight into freedom from conceptual constructs. So the paths of enlightenment that we come across all across the Buddhist teaching is how in what we call then the lesser vehicle, the Hinayana, realizes lack of self in person. So they understand no self. And again, lesser vehicle, this is a term that we use for within the Mahayana. It doesn't refer to any particular tradition out there. It's a doxographical expression, but it is then the foundation in terms of, you could say, a progression of insight. So at that point then, what we call Shravakayana and so forth, this realizes the lack of self in person, in terms of that there's no self, but it fails to realize selflessness of phenomena, the sort of greater understanding that all phenomena lack any kind of reality. So they still hold on to that there's some sort of ground, the building blocks of phenomena, if you like. So the greater vehicle realizes the complete nature of emptiness, and as there's no reference point there in terms of neither time nor space, then this is what ultimately frees the mind. This is the insight that's without any cognitive obscuration. Now, when we arrive at an understanding of a realization of lack of personal self, this ends the afflictions. Now, we talk about two kinds of obstructions to enlightenment, or obscurations. And one is the obscuration of the afflictions, the kleshas, and the other is the cognitive obscuration. So when we're free from afflictions, then naturally there's peace, and that puts an end to samsara. And this is what we would refer to as then the insight of the lesser vehicle. Now, there's two kinds of afflictive emotions. There's gross and there's subtle. So the gross one is the one that we learn, and that sort of just is part of our habit. But there's a very subtle, innate sense of self. The imputed afflictive emotions are abandoned on the first bhumi, and the innate afflictive emotions, they're abandoned by the time of the 8th bhumi. So that's only at the time of the 8th bhumi that really there is a complete freedom from the afflictive emotions. But already at the first bhumi, there is this kind of realization. Of course, we're presently investigating in terms of establishing a view. So that's where the view is something that enables us to have a vision of where we're going. That's where we look and we see, no self. As a basis of no self, then also the whole drama around the self falls away. We can appreciate how the drama around the self, which are all the kleshas, attachment, aversion, and what comes from that, is a flawed project. It's grounded on a delusional assumption. And that's why already presently, even though we're not on the first bhumi, there's already now an insight into the importance of freeing ourselves from these afflictive emotions. So we do this initially through understanding it, and then gradually also this complete basic sense, like Douglas Duckworth says, we wake up in the morning, the first thing we have is a sense of I. So eventually that, you could say, deep innate one that we carry from lifetime to lifetime, that also is abandoned. Now then there's the cognitive, this is the afflictive emotions that obscure us. And this then is addressed by even in the lesser vehicle to some extent. Now the cognitive obscuration is the duality of subject, object, and action. As you can imagine, that's pretty subtle. That's where you could say the beginning bodhisattva, they will still think, gosh, I'm doing a great job here, The great bodhisattvas, they would do a great job, but they wouldn't think, oh, I'm doing a great job. They would just do a great job without having any kind of confused, insecure, delusional sense of, oh, I'm doing something great. I'm doing this I am doing this for that person. And that's where the cognitive obscuration, it persists for a very long time, and that is this sense of subject, object, and action. So that understanding comes from a much deeper, not particularly emotional or afflicting, but more a delusional sense of self that is simply misunderstanding the nature of self, the perceptions and actions. So we would say that until the seventh bhumi, the abandonment and realization, meaning the elimination of these obscurations and the realization of the freedom from these, they're the same for the lesser and greater vehicles. And yet, we would say that the degree to which the lesser vehicles understand emptiness is like he was saying, it's a bit like the difference between a gulp of water and the whole ocean. But at the end of the day, then this realization is far greater than in the Bodhisattva's realization of emptiness is far greater than as it extends in a much greater understanding of emptiness. So this is also with those of you who studied the introduction to the middle way, the Madhyamika Avatara, we would say until the seventh bhumi, they are the same. From the seventh bhumi onwards, then the Bodhisattva far exceeds the ordinary Shravakas. So we have this here then, where we have a little overview here. These are essentially the three kinds of beings. There's ordinary beings, then we have bodhisattvas here on the various grounds, and then we have Buddha. So ordinary beings, as they progress along the path, and we have here the 5 paths, yeah? So that when we're on the first 2 paths, we are essentially what's called an ordinary being. Path of accumulation, we study the teaching, we familiarize ourselves with the teaching. Path of joining is when then the practice really takes hold. And then there's 2 levels, warmth and forbearance. So that's an ordinary being. Now, what is relinquished at the path of accumulation is the gross delusion. So that's where the worst sort of assumptions, they're eliminated. At the level of the path of joining, then the more subtle aspects, they're then eliminated. The first path is somewhat intellectual understanding. This also, you say, extends into the path of joining, and then eventually there's more experience. Metaphor, description of the moon, then the drawing of the moon, And then the reflection of the moon, increasing, you could say, becomes increasingly vivid. Excuse me. Now, at the level of the path of seeing, to arrive at the path of seeing is actually to arrive at the first bhumi. And that is where then there's a genuine insight into selflessness. So that's then where what is afflicted, what is relinquished there, the imputed and afflictive cognitive obscurations. And the quality of knowledge, again, is first here we have experience. Here we have much greater degree of experience, realization. And that is then where we have, and we call it the path of seeing, because we're actually seeing reality, but we're just seeing a part of it. Of course, when we see the crescent moon, we know the whole moon is there. We're just not seeing it. So in that sense, all what really is taking place from then onwards is just an increasing, you could say, manifestation of what is known at this point. But that is then where the Bodhisattva, they persevere. They persevere through the path of meditation. That's the fourth path, and until the seventh bhumi, then the innate cognitive obscurations, they're relinquished, and then the bodhisattva ground, and that is where then at this level the Shravakas, they have some understanding, but it doesn't compare to the bodhisattvas then that relinquish all the innate cognitive obscurations completely. And that's also why we would say the bodhisattva's aspiration is so much greater. Okay, I'm just going to cut the webcam. The bodhisattva's aspiration is so much greater because it doesn't hold back in terms of wishing to have a personal peace. There's the complete abandonment of that, because also the innate cognitive obscurations simply lead to having no fixation on or any desire to, you could say, preserve an individual experience of peace, what we call the state of Gokpa or Nirodha, which also is called then the Arhats, you could say small nirvana. So that's on the path of meditation. Then this leads to, oh yeah, and that's again here, increasing familiarity with realization. That's the quality of knowledge. And the metaphor is then that increasingly there's more and more of the moon that's seen. So then we come to the fifth path, and that's what we call the path of no more learning. And that's where everything, all obscurations have been abandoned. And this is Buddhahood. And there's complete realization. And again, the metaphor of that is the full moon. And this metaphor is used a lot. We have it in the Wheel of Existence, where the Buddha stands and points to the full moon. And of course, like I mentioned before, this is because in India, the moon is the sign of relief. In India, you live with intense heat. Particularly, you should have compassion for the people in Delhi these days. They're having a tremendous heat wave, and Delhi in the month of May already is incredibly hot. So that it's even hotter is really bad. On top of that, there was some spontaneous combustion of these great places, where these great landfills, which are just full of plastic. So there was spontaneous combustion apparently, so that all this plastic that's sitting out in the landfills is just sending all this toxic plastic smoke in over Delhi. Terrible. that's not a fitting image here, as we're trying to sort of proceed towards the relief of nirvana. But anyway, now you have some idea of how the logic of the five paths and what they do in terms of the delusions that are relinquished. So there's a significant difference between two Mahayana approaches. There's the gradual sutra vehicle, which is very much that which works with the rational intellect. It's very rational. The resultant mantra vehicle is much more about experience. Duckworth says it's more sort of, you could say, there's more implication in terms of engagement. So that's where the Vajrayana, it doesn't just say there's an experience out there or it exists as an ontological dimension and so forth, but they actually engage it in terms of this vision of purity, as how purity plays out in terms of the manifestation of body, speech, and mind, how all appearances are pure. You could say intrinsically, their very nature is pure. When there's no obscuration, the very nature of all appearances, body, speech, and mind are innately pure. And that is what the Bodhisattva then begins to experience on what we call the three pure grounds. And that is where reality is properly seen. So it's not just that we're imagining that everything's pure, but we're understanding that phenomena intrinsically are pure. It's just like we would say when we have jaundice, we look at a white conch and we would see it as yellow. But the conch is white, even though we might see it as yellow. So if we visualize the conch as yellow, as if we visualize the conch as white, that's that cuts through our present deluded perception that is yellow, and it connects us, or it enables us to relate to the actual condition of how things actually are. So if somebody comes and asks us while we're seeing the conch yellow because of our jaundice, says, what color is that conch actually really? Then we would say it's white, because we know it's white. So it's only on the basis of our obscurations we're seeing it yellow. Similarly, it's only on the basis of our obscurations that we see ourselves and others in terms of impure perception, according to our particular karmic disposition, our karmic projection. But the reality of the world, the reality of ourselves, is that they are pure. And that's why the visualization of and the practice that we have in the Vajrayana is essentially aligning ourselves with how reality intrinsically is. This is an important point because sometimes there's a sort of, we're going to see there's some traditions where they would say, oh yeah, you just visualize that. It's just a skillful means, and the view actually doesn't change. It's still the view of emptiness, and it's just sort of what is it again? You make it to you fake it till you make it, or it's just sort of a thing that you're imagining. But actually, no, it's very much, that's why we call it Maha Yoga. It's what aligns us with, it's a great yoga of aligning ourselves with this, seeing things for how they actually are. So the Vajrayana entails deeper engagement than we have in the causal vehicle of characteristics in dialectic. There's a much greater profundity in terms of aligning ourselves with how things are. So as far as the first three paths we looked at before, they're achieved through the gradual path, through first understanding, experience, and then realization. So as such, they sort of traverse experience and actual direct understanding of wisdom. That's where, again, we differentiate how ordinary beings, and that's, you could say, the scope of the general, the causal vehicle, the general Mahayana. We meditate on consciousness, on the sense of we abide by our confined perception of how things are. Again, you should study in the Wednesday, we'll be covering this, but that's why we would say there's a confined science, there's a confined valid cognition in regards to our ordinary perceptions that essentially happen on the basis of our ordinary consciousness. Whereas there's the vision that's engaged through wisdom, that is then the scope of the Vajrayana path, and that's then the scope of sublime beings. So practitioners of Mahamudra, the Great Seal, or Mahasandhi, the Great Perfection, they meditate on the actual nature of mind. So they are actually meditating on wisdom. So although they have, such practitioners, they have the introduction to the nature of mind, we would say that they are adopting, seeing not just in terms of thinking, but directly through experience. They then see nature, the nature of mind, the nature of reality. That is then called the path of seeing in Tantra. But it's not the way that's understood in the general Mahayana, which of course, like Douglas Duckworth says, has something like 1,200 different qualities. That's not present there. But nevertheless, the path of the Vajrayana, it enables these qualities to become manifest, just like, again, like the waxing of the moon. So that's where the insight of the actual nature of mind then becomes the actual the foundation for this integration through the path. Again, coming back to the ground, path, and fruition. So Tantra is particularly to the Nyingma path, we have this ascending tenets that continue through the Tantras. And again, he makes a point, this is particular to the Nyingma paths. The Samapas are the new translations. They would say there can be nothing higher than there can be nothing higher than the view of the paramitas, which is freedom from conceptual constructs. And famously, Sakya Pandita, he says, if there's more than freedom from constructs, then it necessarily becomes a construct, where he's completely right. But the thing is, what we will see here, what we're talking about is not so much the emptiness nature, but more the way in which the relative appearances, they are perceived with increasing purity. And that's where then there is a view that's higher with regards to the appearances. Not so much even though there is some difference possibly in terms of the understanding the ground nature, it still, you could say, aligns with the paramita vehicle, but it's in terms of the perceptions. There the view is increasingly profound, increasingly, you could say, true to what is seen by sublime beings. So we're familiar with, when we study the tenet systems in the general sutra vehicles, the Vibhashika, Sutrantika, Yogacarya, and Madhyamika, in the sutras, there's an increasing subtlety of emptiness that is then approached through analysis. That is where we apply analysis, hard intelligence in terms of our analysis of reality that enables us to have an increasing understanding of how phenomena don't possess the solidity that they appear to have. In the Tantras, there's the increasing immanence. This is, of course, what this chapter is all about, of reality that is approached through experience. And that's where the path of Vajrayana is then the insight into the co-emergent, and particularly on the basis of the practice of Guru Yoga, the blessing of the teacher, on the basis of the devotion of the student, and the compassion of the teacher. There is the experience of the co-emergent as the blessing that emerges through mingling with the teacher's wisdom. And that's where the Vajrayana then engages, not just in an analysis and just settling, you could say, settling the mind in shamatha vipassana, but direct approaching into this wisdom, the wisdom of realization that is then approached through experience. And that's where, again, we would say that the higher the view, as we proceed through from the outer tantras up through the inner tantras, wisdom becomes more immanent in the sense that it's seen to be more and more spontaneously present. So the higher the view, the more sudden the process of realization. So that's where there's more and more this, how, the outer tantras, they would say, realization within 16 lifetimes, 7 lifetimes, 3 lifetimes. And the inner tantras, they would say there's very much the possibility of realization within a single lifetime. So back to the Guhyagarbha Tantra, the secret essence Tantra, then we talk about five kinds of philosophies, ways that we understand the world. And so there is the correct philosophy of the world. That's where we understand cause and effect, what brings higher rebirth. And essentially, this is something that, apart from our sort of particular materialistic civilization, which has evolved in the West, then most other cultures, and also you could say the pre-modern cultures of the West, understood how the actions that we do have an impact, and particularly in terms of our future rebirths and so on. So that's where there's an understanding of cause and effect. There's ethics and all of that. The philosophy of the vehicle of characteristics is then the gradual path of eliminating obscurations, gradually cultivating realization. And then there's the philosophy of the outer tantras that engages the vision of purity, as we will see, on the basis of enlightenment as embodied, external to us. You could say there's an immanence, and yet it is external. Then we have the philosophy of the general unexcelled yoga. This is then the path of understanding how our mind is intrinsically endowed with the wisdom, and ourselves have from the very origin been inseparable from the deity. And then there's the philosophy of consummation, the great perfection, which is understanding that from the very start, then wisdom is intrinsically who we are. And at that point, then there's no difference between the one who practices and the object of practice. So that's the consummation Hatha Yoga. So that's where then Douglas Duckworth then refers to how Mipham identifies how wisdom is approached. So in the causal vehicle, wisdom arises from behind. There's the elimination of obscurations, and gradually then the realization, the qualities of enlightenment manifests from, you could say, this from behind, we say, gradually. The outer tantras, there we would say it's already imminent, in the sense that it's not something that gradually comes about, but it's something that's already spontaneously there, but it's seen from in front. That's where, again, there's the approach of invoking enlightenment in form of deity, bringing the deity in, and so forth. The inner tantras, they understand again that the deity or wisdom is there intrinsic within our being, has always been there intrinsically. So also it's on the basis of that we have the 9 vehicles that Padmasambhava teaches, and this is also according to the Guhyagarbha Tantra, where the causal vehicles, they're associated with what we call the Shravaka Yana, Pratyekya Buddha Yana, Bodhisattva Yana. The outer tantras have to do with the Kriya Yoga Tantra, Upa Yoga Tantra, and Yoga Tantra. And then finally we have what is known as the Anuttara Tantras, or the 3 inner tantras. And that's associated with where wisdom arises from within. And these are then the Mahayoga Tantra, Anu Yoga Tantra, and Atya Yoga Tantra. So Douglas Duckworth says, according to Mipham, the inner tantras do not make a qualitative difference between oneself and the deity that is accomplished or practiced, as opposed to the view of the outer tantras, where the two are set apart. As the culmination of his view, the inner tantras play an important part in his presentation. Within the inner tantras, the view also ascends, culminating in the great perfection at the summit. So that's why we would say teachings like the Guhyagarbha Tantra, they give a conceptual idea of the nature of the great perfection. And that's where, from the very start, we engage then the understanding of reality, but initially through sadhana practice, through visualization, some reference points, and then increasingly subtle reference points through the practice of the yogas of the 2nd and 3rd empowerment. And then finally, then directly merging with the recognition of the absolute nature, which is then the great perfection. So in this way, also the wisdom, the immanence of wisdom, you could say, is increasingly closer as we proceed along the ascending views of the inner tantras. Mipham also says a bit later, further down, he says, Mipham asserts that the first 8 of these 9 vehicles take the mind as the path. Then within the 9th vehicle, which takes wisdom as the path, one becomes a Buddha through realizing the meaning of self-existing awareness of the great perfection. Here again, we see the important place of mind and wisdom distinction in his works. So even within the inner tantras, there's still reference points. So we talk about the development stage, then we talk about the completion stage, but completion stage with reference. And it's only really at the practice at the level of Hatha Yoga, the great perfection, that we talk about the great completion stage, which is completely without any reference point. And so it's at that point then that the wisdom is engaged fully. Until then, there's still reference point, there's still accommodating mind. But this is not really intended to sort of create a hierarchy in terms of, well, I don't want to get involved with the mind. I just want to engage with the wisdom. Because of course we need to acknowledge that we are governed by our ordinary perceptions. We're governed by the projections of mind. And so the skill of the path is that it engages this ordinary conceptual mind and brings it to become a vehicle for then complete realization of wisdom. So just to go over the general philosophical schools as we find it in the general vehicle, that's where we have the great exposition school, the Vibhashika, and that's where the ultimate truth is the irreducible elements. And that's again where we sometimes refer to these as the atomists. So that's the objective identification of how everything really exists in terms of atoms. And also on the subjective level, there's some reference point of what we call momentary, moments of consciousness. So these are said to be irreducible. The Sutra school, which is more epistemological, looks in terms of how we actually don't really touch the objects. What we really just have are what we call universals. And the degree to which we begin to have less entanglement within our projections, then we actually begin to see beyond the universals, and we begin to have a more direct experience of the objects that we're perceiving, and also in terms of our own mind. But that's where both the Great Exposition School and the Sutra School, they still operate with the notion of an external world out there. In the mind only and middle way, which is then the Mahayana schools, then there is the understanding that there is a projection of the perceptions exist essentially as a mental projections. There's not a solid phenomena out there. Again, this does not fall into the solipsistic sort of idea that there's nothing there except me, but it's more that there is an understanding that whatever is perceived in terms of the quality and the nature of the appearances and so on is entirely the creation of the mind. And that's why we understand then that the mind that no longer is entangled within the projections and settles this non-dual mind is absolute. The middle way is the complete abandonment of any reference point whatsoever. And that's where there's not even a reference point in terms of a mind that should be non-dual or the reflexive awareness and so forth. So it's freedom from any such. This is a little bit something that we've touched on here before, and it's also something that we've touched on in the Monday course on the progressive stages of meditation on emptiness. So we have this in terms of the three approaches. Then we have where we had wisdom arising from behind, wisdom from in front, or wisdom within. Then we have the Shravakas, Pratyeka Buddhas, and Bodhisattva Yanas, and Bodhisattva. That's the causal vehicle. Now that's where wisdom arises from behind. The potential time until becoming a Buddha, well, we would actually say the Shravakas, they actually don't become Buddha. They simply just remain as arhats. Even though we would say eventually they will awaken to the Mahayana, and then they will enter the Bodhisattva Yana, and that's where then for 3 incalculable aeons, they are on the path. You might say that's a very long time, but if you think of it, to overcome the cognitive obscuration of subject, object, and action, and see how deeply that runs, then, you know, it might be an sort of an optimistic estimate, 3 incalculable aeons. Anyway, we also understand this very often said that 3 incalculable aeons is also, you could say, very relative. According to the individuals, these 3 incalculable aeons might pass in different ways. Anyway, the outer tantras then consist of what we call the action or kriya tantra, the performance tantra, yoga tantra, Upa, Performance Tantra, and then the Yoga Tantra. And then we have there wisdom rises from in front. And then there are the lifetimes, 16 lifetimes, 7 lifetimes, 3 lifetimes. And that's where, again, here we are talking about how then you could see how the shading becomes deeper. Um, and that's where then there's more immanence. The understanding of enlightenment as out there in the future becomes less and less. And so finally, in the Mahayoga and the Anuyoga of the inner tantras, where wisdom rises from within, there's the possibility of enlightenment in one lifetime. In Hatha Yoga, the great perfection, then wisdom is no longer seen as arising, but the wisdom is seen as being spontaneously present. So that's no, we're not waiting for wisdom at that point. So there's no longer the obscuration and the notion of a reference point of a dualistic mind that needs to be worked with, but they're simply just settling into the wisdom. So at that point, there's no difference between the skillful means and the wisdom, in principle at least. So Douglas Duckworth says, it is important to see that Mipham does not portray Nyingma Tantra as just a unique ritual system. He also emphasizes a special view. Tsongkhapa, in contrast, made the distinction between Sutra and Tantra by pointing to Tantra's deity yoga. Thus, Tsongkhapa argued that the distinction between Sutra and Tantra is not a difference in view, but simply a difference in method. Tantra uses the method of ritual identification of the meditator and the deity. Mipham, however, argued that there is not only a distinct method, there is also a distinct view within Tantra, namely the indivisibility of purity, divine presence, and equality, emptiness, which we will see in this chapter. The view is put into play. The view is put into play in how one identifies with the divine in the practice of deity yoga. Therefore, in presenting the distinction between Sutra and Tantra, there is significant difference in emphasis, with Tsongkhapa focusing on method and Mipham highlighting the distinction in view. So there you can view the translations that we have here. Now, what's significant here is that the view is higher, and that's also where we talk about the two truths within the Nyingma understanding of the Tantras, is that the two truths, they then become what we call the higher two truths, in which there's the purity. The relative truth is understood in terms of purity, divine presence. All appearances are established as divine, as pure, and the equality in which the nature of samsara and nirvana is increasingly extinguished, and it's understood entirely in terms of equality. So that's okay. So here in the section 2 and 2, then Douglas Duckworth says, according to Mipham, the unique view of Tantra is the view of great purity and equality of all that appears and exists. Purity and equality, like appearance and emptiness, are indivisible. Mipham describes the view of great purity as seeing beings and the world as divine. So this is the relative truth, if you like. And this is truth. It's not as if we're sort of just imagining something, but this is the very nature of perceptions, in that they are empty, they're free of any, you could say, innate obscurations or projections that we might have. And that's where we're seeing them pure, seeing them for what they are. And this again, of course, is the scope of sublime beings, but nevertheless, we can assess that, or we can accept that in terms of just understanding, yes, phenomena actually does exist without our interference. And that's where we talk about phenomena as being the unity of appearance and emptiness. This constitutes then how we see relative truth. So that's referred to as purity, and it's on the basis of that that we engage in the various yogas of deity, mantra, and wisdom. He goes on to say, in Sutra, appearances are said to be illusions. In Tantra, however, appearances are also said to be divine. They're illusions, yes, but they're also pure. Mipham supports the view of divine appearances with reasoning. He argues that people with undefiled perception see reality as it is, while people infected by defilements perceive a distorted reality. This is readily evident in the fact that a sober person sees one moon while someone who has drunk too much whiskey sees two. So it's a question of, it's an epistemic question of whether we see properly or not. But this is not something that where we just accept that on the basis, well, you know, those sublime beings, they see that. But it is actually established on the basis of reasoning, the reasoning that just like we establish emptiness with reasoning, and we could say, of course, that is the scope of bodhisattvas, we can also establish it on the basis of reasoning, and similarly also with regards to purity. So Douglas Duckworth says, his arguments to establish purity reflect his arguments for emptiness. For instance, he says the same reasons that are set forth to show that reality is not empty actually support the case for emptiness. So we might say, oh, things are not empty. Look how they operate in the world. They're very real. Well, the very fact that phenomena operate and work is because they're dependently arisen. So the more that you show phenomena, which all clearly are dependently arisen, the more you're showing emptiness. This is an important one. In the same way, he says, the reasons one may put forth to support that reality is not pure, such as because there are appearances of impurity, are turned around to support the case for their status of pure. For example, they appear as impure due to deluded perceptions. So that's where we can see that the impurity that we are attributing to phenomena entirely comes on the basis of the subjective projection onto phenomena. Mipham argues that since reality does not appear the way it really is due to delusion, one must cultivate the path to actualize it, just as one must with emptiness. And that, of course, here it applies. It's about us eliminating our, you could say, delusion, our cognitive, you could say, malfunction. Mipham insists that without the certainty of the ultimate, meditating on the relative as divine is just an aspiration. It is not the view. He argues that meditating on deities while thinking that the nature of samsara is impure is like putting perfume on a vomit bucket. He adds that it is an arrogant contradiction to meditate on the world and beings as pure while thinking they are impure. This will not bring about transformation, just as washing coal will not make it white. Such a path is a mere reflection of the actual one. So that's again where it's important to really understand the establishment of purity, of what we call the infinite purity of all phenomena, is understood as understanding things for what they are, not imagining that they are something. So, for example, you know, we might be meditating on deities, but we still think, oh, that person is good, that person is bad, and so forth. And that's where we're failing. That is essentially breaking the samaya and the commitment of the path. If we are engaging in that particular yoga. So of course you could say it's an aspiration. So that's why you could say, yes, it sort of creates good habits, a little good habit, but it's actually not engaging the actual view. It's not engaging the intention. So the reasoning that we're drawing on in this context is what we call the valid cognition that establishes the extremely hidden. So of course, this is the scope of sublime beings. So it is just like we would say phenomena like karma, previous lives, and so forth. They are the direct, they're the direct scope of persons with little obscuration. And that's where we would say sublime beings, they're able to assess what is extremely hidden. Of course, what we can do is we can apply inferential logic. So we can, for example, understand rebirth, karma, and so forth on the basis of what we can infer in terms of our confined perceptions. But nevertheless, direct perception is the scope of, you could say, the yogic valid cognition, or the scope of the valid cognition of sublime beings. Also here, we rely on scriptural authority. Just like to a large extent, we rely on scriptural authority for a lot of things in terms of what's out in the universe, in terms of what's happening at subtle subatomic levels and so forth. So there's all sorts of things that we don't know, you know, but we rely on scriptural authority. Like I say, I'm always saying, you know, I've never seen Argentina, but I gather that it's there. I trust the authorities that state that Argentina actually does exist. And then Upadesha, and then finally also this kind of reasoning draws on pith instructions from an authentic master, where on the basis of the blessing of a particular teaching and particular instructions, we might actually get it, how purity exists as the spontaneous nature of our reality. Now, the relative truth, this is going to then the two higher truths of the Vajrayana. The relative truth of appearances are seen as pure, the view of phenomena. Ultimate truth of emptiness, the equality of samsara nirvana, is the view of suchness. Their indivisibility is established within the experience of then the wisdom of reflexive awareness. So it's not as if these two truths are two different things, but within that undiluted condition of reflexive awareness. And again, we have to be careful. We're not giving it, you could say, ultimate status in terms of, you could say that it's not empty or that it's inherently existing, but we are talking about it is what constitutes authentic experience. So the sutra approach is that relative truth of dependently arisen phenomena, that's relative truth. The ultimate truth is their emptiness. This is realized as the unity of appearance and emptiness. So this is the sutra approach. In the mantra teaching, relative truth is the divine nature of purity, of reality seen without obscuration. Ultimate truth is the equality of samsara and nirvana. Their unity is then the experience of the indivisible sphere of the wisdom of reflexive awareness. And particularly then, if we are practitioners, we sometimes come across the expression, the unity of the development and completion stages. And that's where we would say the relative appearance of the divine nature of purity and the ultimate truth of the equality of emptiness. This is combined within this condition of the nature of mind or the wisdom of reflexive awareness. So that's where, keeping that in mind, then we practice what's called the unity of appearance and emptiness. So Mipham Rinpoche says, Dr. Duckworth is right. Mipham presents the unity of purity and equality in Tantra in a way that mirrors the unity of appearance and emptiness in Sutra. So it builds, right? We've seen how he integrates emptiness from the middle wheel and appearance from the Buddha Nature Sutras of the last wheel by stating that both are the definitive meaning. Both the second and the third turning of the wheel, they are the definitive meaning. A similar integration can be seen in his interpretation of the view of Tantra. Moreover, we also find this unity of appearance, of emptiness and appearance in the Great Perfection, where the corresponding qualities of primordial purity, kada, and spontaneous presence, lundru, or empty essence, ngo, tongpa, and the natural clarity, rangshin selva, are predominant themes. Once again, we see the theme of unity that characterizes Mipham's interpretation across his Buddhist works. So we talk about the emptiness nature that has that luminous quality. So this is basic to understanding the way that we understand the second and the third turning. It's also the way that we understand the two main principles of the Great Perfection, which is what we call primordial purity, the nature of emptiness, and the spontaneous presence, that within that emptiness, all the qualities of enlightenment are spontaneously present. And sometimes when we talk about meditation, particularly in the Vajrayana context, the Great Perfection teachings, then we sometimes talk about understanding how awareness, its essence is empty, and yet it has a natural character or natural clarity. So these two are inseparable. Sometimes we talk about the inseparability as these two, sort of is the unity. So to conclude, thank you for hanging in here, because this is, of course, dense material, but I also would say this is the premise that you have already studied the material, and what I'm hopefully achieving here is to just, you say, summarize it, and this hopefully clarifies things. So, conclusion, Jamgön Mipham is seen to sympathize and agree with whatever doctrine he writes on. Yeah, this is brilliant, right? Because he goes in there and he understands the wisdom of this, and this is so essential. Really, he doesn't go in there and says they think differently. He sees, he sees the brilliance. But he says this reflects his panoramic vision. He sees the unity in the intention of wisdom. He sees the brilliance of the great perfection reflected in all the teachings of Sutra and Mantra. And this, of course, signifies the view of someone who has realized the great perfection is that all the various teachings, they essentially reflect and are skillful means in realizing the great perfection. So there's nothing that's abandoned. But at the same time, also someone would say, oh, well, you know, sometimes it's when there's tension between the viewpoints, then so much emerges. And as we've seen, it's not as if Mipham shies away from the tensions between the viewpoints, but he also does actually succeed in incorporating and seeing how the various viewpoints actually, they have a role in terms of what he's wishing to communicate in terms of this greater vision that comes from the great perfection. And again, this is, of course, something that his teacher, Jamgön Khyentse Wangpo, requested him to put down in writing and to clarify. So Douglas Duckworth writes, despite the problems of such an approach to the Buddhist textual traditions from India, meaning this sort of, you could say, unified approach. What is that? So he says, despite the problems of such an approach to the Buddhist textual traditions from India, unified vision is not without value. Although critical acumen is vital for perceiving the differences among views, an ability to appreciate the value of a plurality of viewpoints and integrate them so they are mutually supportive can also enrich one's own tradition, which in Mipham's case is the great perfection. Along with a critical component of open-minded analysis and debate, another important factor that sustains the vitality of traditions is the ability to assimilate the past with the present and organize diversity into a comprehensive and meaningful whole. And that, of course, also is where Duckworth points out that Mipham Rinpoche has had centuries in which these debates have been taking place, and he can actually see the validity of the various points, but then sort of joins them together so that they work together without any conflict, and they really constitute, or rather they sort of become part of and sustain this unified vision. For whatever reasons, Mipham is easily one of the most influential, if not the most influential scholar in Tibet within the last 500 years. While it is not possible to capture the extent of his contributions in a few pages, I have tried to give a sense of his approach to Buddhist philosophy and practice by highlighting some important themes in his writings. And I would like to say, really, this is an understatement, and having somehow been a little bit around the block in a lot of the way that this is presented in a classical context, particularly in a modern world, it's rare to find anybody who has such an ability to actually cover the scope of Mipham Rinpoche's scholarship. I wouldn't say Douglas Duckworth, because that would have been impossible. I have read every one of Mipham Rinpoche's writings, but the most important themes that are relevant for us who are practicing within this tradition are very well represented here and represented with tremendous clarity. So I would say what we have here really is an enormous service to the Buddhist teaching in this rather slim volume, touching on some really important points and giving a very accurate and, you could say, satisfactory, inspiring presentation of what really informs our perspective, our view, that again informs the practice and the path that we're undertaking here. So immensely valuable. So thank you for hanging in there, and I'm just gonna go through the questions here, but I think we should be able to manage it. I think there's only 2 questions. All right, you're welcome to come up with some. I guess this probably gets asked a lot. How is the view of Shentonpas different from the non-Buddhist schools like Advaita Vedanta, Kashmir Shaivism, or the more non-dual oriented streams of Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Taoism, etc.? That they're Majamicans. So the Shentonpas, they would say that all the various aspects, including also non-dual, the non-dual mind, is empty, and that's where they would take down all the various schools that you Advaita, Vedanta, etc. They would take them down as being still premised on you could say some substantialist views. They would say everything is empty, and they would identify, when they talk about Buddha nature and its qualities, they would say this is the very nature of that emptiness. So they would be able to, they are to be distinguished between from these other schools, that because what you're saying here is essentially, the Yogacarya, they do talk about non-duality, and it says the Yogacarya, they to some extent they are similar to the Advaita Vedanta in at least when it comes to the relative functioning consciousness. But they would still, even the Yogacarya would still talk about the two truths, and would still also assert emptiness as premise for actually fully unveiling these qualities of the absolute nature. So there are some differences, but I would like to also humbly acknowledge that I would probably not be, you could say, competent to, do the actual debate. But I can just say that we can assume that there are arguments that set the Shentong apart from some of these other schools. Yeah, I would recommend reading Dolpopa, Sherab Gyaltsen. There's one that's called The Buddha from Dolpo. So that in there you would probably get a more satisfactory response to your question. In line of speech, Mipham writes, the real Buddha potential must be the compounded aspect which is able to produce results. But by such a thing, the wisdom intention of the Mahayana Sutras, which declare that the naturally present Buddha potential is the uncompounded Dharmadhatu, the expanse of ultimate reality, is reduced to nothing. The imputation of Dharmadhatu must be the non-figurative ultimate truth, the great union of the two truths, and is no way found. So yes, so that's where the understanding of the Buddha potential could never be something that is compounded. So I'm not sure where this looks tricky, because the rest is, you can say, valid exposition in terms of the nature of the Buddha nature, the Dharmadhatu, and so on. Yeah. Speaking to this union, he seems to also speak of emptiness of other. Is it not so? Well, yes, in the sense that the conventionally we would say Buddha nature possesses his authentic experience. It has the conventional quality of the emptiness of other, but he would still say that it cannot withstand absolute analysis. In Mantrayana, our relative appearance is somewhat synonymous with symbols or metaphors, so that we purify our perception of appearances such that their meaning or symbolism is reconciled to their nature, which is emptiness. And this is what is meant by the qualities of enlightenment, so that they are forms of emptiness. A little bit different, and it's true in the development stage practice. We talk about the recollecting the purity. One face symbolizes the Dharmadhatu, the two arms symbolize means and wisdom, and so on. But this is different. This is actually where we're more talking about an ontological vision of the unity of appearance and emptiness. And that's where we talk about relative appearances as being pure. But in that we engage subjectively our being as deity, then we would not see the deity as just sort of a particular reified entity, but more as an expression of the qualities of enlightenment, of Buddha nature. That's why we have this recollection of purity. But what we talk about in terms of pure appearances, divine appearances, is actually seeing all phenomena as being, you could say, the unity of appearance and emptiness, and as such, being a realm in which everything not only is, you could say, empty and manifest, but also possessing a vibrant quality in which the what we call kayas and jhanas, the various qualities of enlightenment, are manifest. If we read the life stories of great masters and so on, we can see how their perceptions change. And maybe also when we do practice, we also notice probably sometimes that, when we do a bit of okay meditation, then also our perceptions begin to take on a different quality, less entangled with the ordinary projections. Second turning of the wheel, yes, from subject perspective, third turning of the wheel from third turning from objects. I think it's more the second turning is more from this object perspective. This sound familiar to the statement less a vehicle, realized non-self a person, Mahayana, realized non-self a phenomenon. May I ask for more clarification? Well, the lesser vehicle, they realize the non-self of person, but they don't realize the non-self of phenomena in principle. There's still a limitation. The Mahayana is the complete realization of no self. But that's where, in terms of that, we are talking about the second turning of the wheel as accomplishing that accomplishment of understanding the absolute emptiness of all phenomena is, you could say, the objective emptiness of all phenomena. That's achieved through the teachings of the Prajnaparamita, the Madhyamaka, and in general the teachings on the second turning of the wheel. It's in the third turning of the wheel that we identified that there is a cognitive quality that recognizes that, a cognitive quality that's uncorrupted, and that's the wisdom of Buddha nature. So that more abides in the subject. But as long as we don't have the realization of emptiness, this Buddha nature is veiled, and that's why it's veiled at the time of an ordinary being. It's veiled at the time of also those in the lesser vehicles. So even because of there's still the cognitive obscuration of thinking in terms of some substrate, some that there's still some phenomena, some reference points, then it's also veiled at the level of the lesser vehicles. I hope that clarifies it. The text itself here, I would say some of the questions you've asked here, I would say, even though I answered undoubtedly imperfectly, then revisiting this material will undoubtedly clarify the questions that some of you have. So I'll beg your forbearance in terms of because these are very good questions. But again, I would say if you study go over this book a few times, it'll be very helpful and will clarify these things. In general, also you're touching on some big topics. The sort of the notion of you could say what we call the substantialists, those that still hold on to an absolute, you could say, non-dual mind or a Godhead and so on. That is addressed in the general Madhyamaka teachings. So if you look at Introduction to the Middle Way, also Tsongtse Khyentse Rinpoche's teachings on that. And also, if you look at in the line speech in the line of speech, then the appendix there on Buddha nature, it should hopefully clarify that. And yeah, as far as Mantrayana, the pure appearances, I would recommend a translation of Rongsum Panditas. Well, if you can read it in Tibetan, excellent, but it's called Nangwa Hladru, but it's translated as Establishing Appearances as Divine, translated by Heidi Koch, also with, Heidi Köppel, but also with a substantial forward, which is very good, very helpful. Okay. All right. It seems that there are more and more categories from Sutra Vehicle to Tantrayana. Even Ultimate Truth has 2 categories. How do you think about the categories? There's some Tibetan there in Unicode, but I can't actually see it. Look, that's really well. It's important that we appreciate the depth of the Vajrayana or the Tantrayana. So that's, but also important to understand how it builds on the sutra vehicle. So yes, it becomes slightly more complex. But again, ultimate truth as having two categories, yes, that's actually intrinsic to the Svatantrika, Yogacarya Madhyamika, where they understand they understand ultimate truth in terms of two categories, and also they understand relative truth in terms of two categories. This we also will visit on in our study of the Sword of Wisdom. Can I read the Establishing the Appearance as Divine book if I haven't yet entered into Mantrayana? Oh, that's, gosh, you're in Italian they say non è mica neonato. You weren't born yesterday. That's right. There is a little bit of restriction, and that is true. That we would actually say, and I've actually asked Sonsikan Rinpoche next time he comes to Australia to please give the empowerment of the Guyagaba, or rather the what's called the peaceful wrath of deities. That's the Maya Jala empowerment. Because yes, actually traditionally, and if we do it right, to study the teachings on the Guyagaba, which is what this is. The appearance, establishing appearance as divine, is actually a commentary on the Guyagaba Tantra. So we require empowerment. So that's right. But anyway, I would say, being where we are right now, we're like just ready. We're ready for the picking. We're so ready. If you've been through this study here and you're a practitioner, you know, of course, again, coming back to what Douglas Duckworth was saying, there's so much more an emphasis on implication, experiential implication. And that's also why in Tibetan Buddhism, you very often have this sort of the teaching on the preliminary practice right away, because yes, it does actually, it's given with the very, you could say, positive outlook that the student could actually begin to engage with the experience pretty early on. As you can see here we're engaging more with you could say a dialectical approach of analysis, understanding, and so forth. But traditionally then Vajrayana students have sometimes just engaged directly with the wisdom, and that's where the practice of Nyingma comes into place. Anyway, thank you so much, all of you, for your engagement in this practice. It will be of great benefit for yourself and also for others. So there's a lot of virtue in what we've achieved here, I think. So thank you very much. And I'll just conclude then with dedication. By this accumulation of merit, may all by this accumulation of merit, may I obtain all-seeing omniscience, and may all faults be defeated. The whirling, turbulent waves of birth, aging, sickness, and death. From this ocean of samsara, may I liberate beings. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen may it never fail, but grow and flourish ever more and more. Through all my lives, may I remain at your lotus feet and study, reflect, and meditate on your texts again and again. Grant your blessings that I will hold, protect, and spread your teachings to the limits of space for as long as samsara lasts. So, thank you very much. No, this was the last session today. I know in the registration, I put in an extra. I was at a moment I was debating whether there should be 1 or 2 sessions, but this was the last one. Yeah. So, thanks again.